I'm Max Clark. This is a tale from the good old days. And I'll title this, I'll say, this is one of the most effed up things I've ever seen a CEO do in a company. I was working for this company, and we had a known credit card fraud issue. When I say we had a known credit card fraud issue, I mean, this is a long time ago. This is before, things like Stripe were even like a consideration in the world. If you were large enough, you actually had your own credit card gateway devices, like physical boxes that you had installed in your infrastructure somewhere, and then you were integrating with. And we had rudimentary tools for credit card processing. So maybe you could do address match. CVV2 was available. But the problem with both of these things is they weren't very consistent. So you could do an address match, but your false negative rate on an address match was high enough that you were losing a significant percentage of valid transactions through it. So address verification very quickly became zip code only verification, which also then became, in a lot of cases, just turned off because the amount of revenue. So this is a really interesting conversation to get through with an organization of like risk management, of like thresholding, right? Like, hey, we can turn on address verification, but when we turn on address verification, it's going to block, I don't know, let's pick a number, 30% of our credit card transactions. And of that 30% of our credit card transactions, we think 10 to 12% of those transactions are actually good. And that's good revenue that we're losing. So is it worth losing, right? Like do the math. Is it worth losing that 12% to block that 18% or not, right? Okay, what happens if we turn off, a street verification? We're just looking for city and state zip code, right? And then you kind of like work your way down to where you're only doing zip code verification pretty quickly. And then again, there's a conversation. It's like, well, we think we're losing X% of valid transactions. It just gets turned off, right? And when you see this happening, it's a very interesting experience because people are making decisions to accept fraud in order to increase revenue, right? So this is the first kind of like checkbox, and that, like when I said like most effed up thing I've ever seen a CEO do. This was the slippery slope that started down the process. Okay, so address verification gets turned off. So then you have CVV2. You have that like the 3 or 4 digit, if you have Amex, the digit codes. And the same thing, when you turn that on, you lose a certain percentage of transactions. Hopefully you're losing a very small percentage of valid transactions, but you're not really 100% sure, but there's always this thing of like, oh, we're losing X percentage of transaction. So we had that on for a while, and then they decided to turn it off. So we got down to the situation where the only real validation that was happening was, does the card type match the actual digits? And by the way, all Visas start with the same number or same set of numbers. All MasterCard, I wouldn't even call it verification. I mean, nowadays you see really good payment systems implemented where you start typing in your credit card number. It doesn't prompt you for what the card type it is. You put in your card number and it automatically will display to you like, oh, you got a Visa card, right? Like it'll just display it to you. So one by one, all these things get turned off. So then what we start seeing happening is we start seeing people doing credit card validation against our platform. And you can see this in real time. Like you just tail the log file and you can just see people. And they would do it at certain times at night, and they would just come through, and they know, they could enter the card, and our system would, the way it was set up is it would validate the card before the actual checkout. Like it wouldn't charge the card, it would pre-auth the card, right? So you could pre-auth the card with a certain amount of money. We'd be pre-authing the cards, and all of a sudden you just see somebody run like a batch of just cards would just, flow down the list, and you knew it was just absolute garbage, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't do anything about it because the pointy-haired bosses, the executives, didn't want to disable this functionality because they didn't want to lose the revenue. I didn't understand at the time. I was still too early in my career to really understand the corporate dynamics and the corporate politics. And what I found out later, which actually answered this question, which this leads into the second part of this, is the executive team, explicitly the CEO, had an MBO tied to top-line revenue and top-line revenue growth, not gross profit, not net top line. There was no incentive structure in place for the executive team to block this. In fact, it was good for them to have this in place because it inflated the revenue numbers. Like, think about that one for a second. Think about the incentive structure that existed at this company for the decision makers of this company, that this was in place. So there was, oh my God, just thinking about this story, it's just crazy. It's so long ago. I mean, this is over 20 years from me now. Okay, so then the process gets changed a little bit. We him and haw, and this all goes through, and I'm just remembering another part of the story that I have to share. The decisions are made to change the pre-auth process a little bit, right? So we don't actually pre-auth the card until farther in the shopping cart, and that what that actually forces to happen is it forces a transaction to actually occur in order to validate the card. More steps, it makes it a little bit harder. We think, to slow down the people that are doing this stuff. It's going to be the fix, yada yada yada, and all it really does is it just generates like actual garbage transactions against our system. And the hilarious thing about this is the pattern that this company then fell into was all this junk would flow through and hit the top line. It would hit our gross revenue our gross income number. Yay, everything's great. MBOs are hit, bonuses are paid out, yada, yada, yada. And then somewhere within that next, 90-ish days cycle, the chargebacks would actually flow through. And the chargebacks would flow through in a way that were disconnected from wouldn't flow into the actual system that was processing the credit cards, but the finance team would deal with it. This company was getting absolutely creamed with chargebacks because, double-digit percentages of its credit card volume. When I say, okay, what's the actual math here? We were processing about, I want to say, just for the website, our primary partner source for traffic acquisition was somewhere around like $80,000 or $90,000 a day. So that one of the traffic acquisition sources going to the website was about $80,000 or $90,000 a day. Somewhere I've got an Excel spreadsheet that has all these numbers. So there's a call $200,000 a day worth of credit card transactions flowing through this stuff, and double-digit percentages of that is just fraud, like just flat out. Like fraud. If you know anything about credit card processing, the chargeback is really bad for the merchant because not only does 100% of the charge get pulled back from you, you also lose your credit card processing fees, which by the way, back then were very expensive, and you pay penalties. So if you say for every dollar processed that was fraudulent, you probably lose $1.20 on the backside. So if you think about this in terms of what the actual, so double-digit percentages of fraud revenue, so if it was $200,000 a day, $20,000 to $40,000 a day worth of fraud, instead of $200,000 a day of revenue, you really like all of a sudden immediately you're like $140,000 a day worth of revenue, minus, right? And again, there was absolutely zero incentive structure to fix this. There was no check and balances. The CFO was a total disaster for other things. Obviously, the board wasn't paying any attention, and it was wild. That eventually changes a little bit. And the way that it changed introduced another incentive structure, which was the CEO then telling the finance department not to pay bills. I don't know how this one worked out for them because it was a public company and you have to do accrual accounting. Actually, maybe at this point they were delisted, so they weren't reporting the same way. But if you're doing accrual accounting, you have, you're recording your expense when it's actually received and booked. So not paying the bill is a free cash flow issue, but not necessarily like a P&L issue. So I don't know how the heck this one got done. For this MBO. But the CFO, or the CEO, we had the money, right? So the CEO would just stop paying bills. You could tell when we were pushing into whatever thing it was because there was just this mandate, don't pay any bills. And the company had a 300-ish person call center that was open 24/7. There was, there was 20 T1s worth of voice capacity feeding the via Definity phone system that was feeding into this call center, right? And all of a sudden it's don't pay the phone bills. And you're like, what do you mean don't pay the phone bills? And I remember this happening because when the and I didn't oversee this part of the company, thank goodness. But when the phone lines got turned off, when the T1s got turned off, I think the CEO and the general counsel were both on vacation. I remember the general counsel, I think, was on a cruise and had to sign and sign and fax paperwork back in order to wire the money in order to pay and get the service turned back on. And it was the craziest fire drill of all time with this. Oh, what was the other thing that I was remembering earlier that was crazy this company did? Oh, yes. I get called one day and, it's called the COO and the general counsel of the company are sitting together in office and are going through the questionnaire for our PCI audit. And the way this stuff works is it's a self-attestation. Who knows how many pages worth of questionnaire online that you have to click through, and then you get to the bottom back and you say, yes, I approve it. And I just remember walking in this meeting of we've got fill in the blank system in place, right? And just looking at them being no, we don't. We were talking about doing that, right? Yeah, we were talking about doing that, but then we decided not to do it because they didn't want to do it. Okay, well, we're talking about it, right? Okay, so we can say yes, that we're going to implement this system. And they go through and they're checking all these boxes. And I was like, oh, geez, I don't want to be in this meeting right now. What was hilarious about that one was I don't know if they just filled something out that just looked completely insane and crazy, or if it was a random selection, but we failed the self-attestation audit and ended up with, I don't know if it was Deloitte or KPMG in our office for a couple of weeks going through. And it wasn't just infrastructure, it's operations, finance, the whole company gets inspected from top to bottom. And I have no idea how they convinced the auditor to actually let them continue to process credit cards with the shenanigans that they were caught doing. I don't know, just some crazy things. And I don't know what percentage of that was the only time I experienced it, but I have to believe that probably isn't the only version of this story. If you've got something like this, comment below, tell me your story. I'd love to hear your version of this. I bet it's a doozy. I'm Max Clark. Talk to you later.
I feel it.